Hi, students. Today I'm gonna lecture and y'all aren't here. Um, Thanks for letting me do this asynchronously. It's Thursday. I'll have it uploaded just basically as soon as I'm done. I'm not going to edit it, I'm just going to upload it. It won't be 50 minutes long. I'm sure none of you are upset about that. So with that, I'm just going to get started. So last time we covered one of the most difficult readings for the course because he, for some reason, chose to write like an idiot. But it's called Apocalypse Forever by Eric Swinjadow. There were a ton of really important concepts in that article, foremost of which is the concept of commodity fetishism. But I do like his critique of sustainability as not going far enough. And I wish he would have just been a better writer. Next time, which would be Wednesday, so almost a week from today, we're going to read Diana Stewart, Ryan Gunderson, and Brian Peterson's 2019 piece, The Climate Crisis as a Catalyst for Emancipatory Transformation, an Examination of the Possible. It's in the journal International Sociology. That'll be our last reading for the course, and that reading so it'll be your last chance to do a memo. And I'm excited to have that last lecture. So today we're going to cover the sociology of climate change as the sociology of loss by Rebecca Elliott. Her work is amazing. She does a lot of really good stuff out there. She's got a book that's about to come out. There are really kind of three main concepts from this piece, which I think could be useful whether you're doing a paper or an artistic project. These are quantitative versus qualitative loss, the sociology of loss in general, and this concept she has called anticipatory ruination. And so anyway, those are the three that are important. She talks a lot about sustainability, obviously, but we've talked about that already. But anyway, so at the broadest level, this article is a call to move from the paradigm of sustainability to one of the sociology of loss. This is so because Elliott argues that the sociology of sustainability is misleading and foolhardy and will never address the actual structural problems that lead to climate change. Now, this article outlines the sociology of loss as a project for sociological engagement with climate change. So just to be clear, it's not like a public sociology that's like directed to just everyday people. This is a call for sociology to change its lens of examination. To get there, the article addresses four interrelated dimensions of loss that climate change presents. These are the materiality of loss, the politics of loss, knowledge of loss, and practices of loss. Now, unlike sustainability, which is the most dominant framing in the social sciences and within like common perception in general of climate change, she argues that the sociology of loss examines what does, will, or must disappear, rather than what can or should be sustained. At this time, the public doesn't look to sociologists to talk about climate change at all, even though we have a really robust understanding of the material. But the motivating question in this piece is not like, what can sociology contribute to climate change? But rather, what can climate change contribute to sociology? So again, this is a call to like change what sociology does. And she argues that if climate change really does haunt sociology, and when she uses those terms, she means she's kind of like looking at the idea that environmental sociology is not that big in sociology, but that it's going to have to be, so it sort of haunts it. She argues that climate change is a question of like depletion and disappearance and collapse. So, people, disproportionately the poor, and in the coming years in the global south, die in floods, storms, and heat waves. And as the climate changes, it changes other things around it in really destructive ways. And so what she asks is, what can and should sociology try to know about this type of social change? The sociology of loss challenges sustainability and adjusts our analytic focus, asking about what does, will, or must disappear, then, rather than what should or might be sustained. Now, if we were doing this in person, I'd do an activity here where we could, think about like what's going to get lost so that other things can be sustained, and then what could take place of that. But because we're doing it asynchronously, I'm not going to do that. But I'm just going to kind of break the article down. So the article proceeds like this. It begins with a discussion of loss, sort of generally, and its emerging place within climate change policy and discourse. It then addresses 4 interrelated dimensions of loss that climate change presents, which, and it anchors that discussion in different traditions of sociological research, which is to say, it kind of does a literature review. While loss is often set at the level of the individual, like a loss of a loved one or loss of income, this article directs our attention, to how climate change can affect collective social processes of human settlement and political mobilization, how knowledge is created, and through practices of consumption. But before we get to these 4 interrelated dimensions of loss, I'd like to say that loss is both quantitative and qualitative. So she makes this point, and it kind of comes out of nowhere. And so you're kind of like, what the hell does that matter? She brings this up because sociology itself is quantitative and qualitative. And she's saying, hey, all you scholars out there, whether you're qualitative or quantitative, you can study this. So for quantitative stuff, there are losses. There's like having less of something. There's like, she gives the example of there being less money at the household level when families have to spend more on like disaster recovery. There's less money at the national level when the productivity of industry declines, and there's less biodiversity, fewer species cohabiting and living on the planet with us. But she argues loss also encompasses the qualitatively distinct, the disappearance of like ways of life, entire landscapes, places and cultures, which certainly we will memorialize, but they can't ever be recovered or compensated or overcome. In either sense, grappling sociologically and politically with loss means anticipating and accepting a certain measure of failure at the level of global action, as states, as cultures, and as individuals, to prevent or avoid some of these forms of destruction. So anyway, on to the 4 interrelated dimensions of loss that climate change presents. And just to recap, these are the materiality of loss, the politics of loss, knowledge of loss, and practices of loss. So in the section on the materiality of loss, she argues that the materiality of loss is a distinct kind of like loss of place. So think here of materiality of like being material, of like being a thing in the world. A distinct kind of loss of place, one in which communities experience like the disappearance of land beneath their feet. If we have the sea level rise that we're going to have, New Orleans will be gone. Much of the Netherlands will be inundated. New York City will have to put up seawalls, and these are just, in the global north and in the US mainly. So they'll have loss of place where you lose the land beneath your feet, and with it, the built and non-human environments that make social life possible, but maybe even more important than just possible, it makes it predictable. And the materiality of loss here refers to like disappearances wrought by shifting coastlines, completely depleted forests, storm-wrecked cities. In brief, the fundamentally altered what she calls ecologies of place. Now, material losses will necessarily intersect with our unequal and stratified world. The populations most vulnerable to desertification, forest degradation, sea level rise, salinization, and biodiversity loss are located almost entirely in some of the world's poorest countries. And it should be said that any like nature social divide and social theory has been unproductive at best. And that's a whole debate that we didn't really cover in this class, but she does make this point that like we don't need to continue worrying about like how to separate the social from the natural because it's really not productive. For a sociology of loss, this requires acknowledgement that, of course, like material losses are engineered in the first place by a complex interaction of human activity and ecological change, but more specifically, the realm of sociologically interesting phenomena related to the materiality of loss isn't defined only in terms of how individuals and groups respond when land is submerged or eroded, burned, or made barren as the result of natural disasters and hazards associated with these rising sea levels and shifting precipitation, extreme hot in some places and cold in others. The sociology of loss addresses how humans actively seek and achieve loss of place through planning carried out in the name of climate change. Projects of transformation undertaken to mitigate or adapt to climate change encourage the abandonment of places or the movement of people away from them. And this enacts a like temporal, which is to say like time related form of loss, in which this sacrifice, this abandonment or destruction of places, the loss of buildings and livelihoods, it's going to preempt future losses. And they might be framed as a result of inevitable, like natural catastrophic change, but like they're going to be loss that individuals feel at like at a visceral level. If your home where you say grew up is inundated by water, you don't have that anymore. You lost your childhood home. So, these material things are things that human beings will feel intimately. Kasia Paprocki calls this anticipatory ruination, which is a discursive and material process of social and ecological destruction in anticipation of real or perceived threats. So this is people talking about or actually physically destroying parts of the planet so that they might be able to save something else. Now, the effects of climate change, for sociologists, maybe we can re-examine how place may be lost or sacrificed to protect or promote other cherished things and ideas. Now, obviously, these choices are fundamentally political. And so it's the politics of loss that Dr. Elliot turns to next. Climate change stretches across vast domains of political contestation, bound up with fights over inequality in particular. And this is something we've talked about in the course so far quite a bit, this distinction between the global north and the global south. But one of these, which we haven't talked about, is in housing. She argues that we, quote, have to find ways to combine the priorities of environmental and housing-oriented movements. There's much to be gained, she says, not only for populations that have experienced oppressive social and spatial marginalization, but for all of us who benefit from lower emission, more sustainable cities. But there's also, she argues, a dimension of loss to these politics, a story about the loss of economic rents and returns on investment, the loss of prerequisites and privileges that accrue not only to the elites and powerful industries that benefit from commodified housing, but also to like property owning middle and working classes. And she brings this up not to just, to say that like, yeah, tons of people are going to be displaced through climate change, and it's going to primarily affect the poor, but I mean, it's also going to affect the middle classes too. But she says we can ask questions about the kinds of politics that losses produce too. What new constituencies and coalitions, what new forms of discourses and claims are created when land disappears or property values in risky areas collapse? If you think about San Diego right now, I mean, some of the most expensive houses are built right on the beach. Well, if sea level rises as they suspect it will, those houses will be like underwater. What's going to happen when those people who once had tons of money no longer have that money? Political sociology can explain how programs are cut or reconfigured, eligibility expanded, benefits enhanced or taken away in ways that directly shape how communities will fare in a climate change world. Who will lose what and when depends on the outcome of these struggles. And so these new coalitions that are going to form are something worth studying. And this is all to say that the category of like climate policy is populated not just by emissions and regulations, building codes, and the like, but also by the broader array of public policies that will have to be made to shape how people live and work. Moving from the politics of loss, we look to the knowledge of loss. This is it's probably the most difficult section, but so she argues that forging a connection between like climate change, this big ephemeral thing, and observed changes, like a few inches of sea level rise or a shift in average temperatures, or single events like a catastrophic flood, like what I was talking about last class period that happened in Germany and Belgium and then in China as well, or a hurricane, is a scientific achievement, yes, but it's also a discursive achievement. And this is specifically the case in the US when you look and you say like, I mean, these floods wouldn't really happen. Like these are like 10,000 year floods, but they're happening like every year now. And so even though scientifically it's your job to tie those things together, it's also our job as social scientists to discursively tie them together, because people on the right here tend to dismiss that and say like, well, I mean, it's just weather, it's unpredictable. But so anyway, she's saying it's a discursive achievement, not just a scientific one. That's where the knowledge comes in. And so in this context, whether and how much of a loss can be identified as like the direct result of climate change is itself at stake, like a matter, like it may appear more or less settled, but you still have to present those facts to other people in a way that convinces them. Now, this is a familiar type of puzzle for sociologists of knowledge and science studies scholars, that's me, who look at how like losses are defined, measured, and attributed through the interaction of experts, technology, and legal and political institutions. But a focus on loss refocuses and turns the conversation on knowledge production and climate change just outside of just those small, just sociologists of knowledge or science and technology studies. It moves it beyond that, because this, again, she's arguing that this is something that sociology as a whole is going to have to deal with. And so she's arguing that sociology as a whole will have to move to studying the way knowledge is produced. And so this, this shifts the question from one of like the social production and contestation of what is true about climate change to one of knowing its effects and distributing that information. The challenge for science and other social institutions is not one of like revealing invisible, elusive, fearful, yet wholly real entities, to quote Sheila Jasanoff, like carbon emissions, but also of recognizing, characterizing, and attributing meaning to those things we observe. in other words, sociology doesn't like only just need to adjudicate how much of a loss is really climate change, but it would be more useful to investigate how social actors see evidence of loss and temporally and spatially limit it in pursuit of different objectives and claims. She argues that this can take place in a variety of sites, including the media, policymaking, courts of law, and because how losses end up being classified in climate change has significant implications for who is expected to do like whatever it is they're expected to do about those losses. And she gives the example of climate refugees. And in the case of climate refugees, describing specific mass movements of people as driven by climate change implies like the involvement of a globally dispersed set of actors in both causing and responding to those movements. It will be, like if it can, and if you expand this to the whole globe, if you say, hey, there are climate refugees everywhere, well, then who's held responsible? That's like it would be really hard to tie that down. And so she's arguing that what social scientists need to do is to try to help delimit that. As we're creating this knowledge, she's hoping, knowledge of loss is also produced through processes of evaluation taking place in governmental and non-governmental entities, which are currently developing conceptual tools for economizing climate-related losses. And so sociologists are going to have to study how those are created. And she's saying that a sociology of loss, something it can do better than sociology of sustainability, is it can trace the feedback loop from monetary valuation to social representation and practices and the way that they loop back to reshape the physical and social world, so that it can show how those things reinforce one another, or what Sheila Jasanoff calls co-produce one another. She argues that our ways of knowing and valuing existing and future losses shape the decisions we make about what to protect and how, where investments in infrastructure are needed and the scale those are going to be at, as well as who can or should take responsibility for compensating the losses that are going to occur. And she's, then she turns to talking about economic rationality. And under the current neoliberal order, I mean, people would attempt to just only economize these things. And she's saying, like, whether or not it's economically rational to respond aggressively to climate change, for instance, depends on like if it will pay off in the long term. If we allow economics to be the deciding factor, like whether it makes economic sense, probably not going to take that leap. Anyway, all of this knowledge of loss informs practices of loss. This is the final section. Recent turns in the sociology of consumption provide tools for understanding this, the practices of loss. Though consumption is always an environmental act, research on sustainability consumption, she argues, often focuses narrowly on symbolic dimensions of green products and services. And it emphasizes the connections between consumption and taste, status definition, and identity. But she argues, I think quite poignantly, that the areas of consumption that most directly affect carbon emissions are housing and transportation and food, which bear a far more ambiguous relation to the forms of display and deliberation and social signaling and individual choice that have preoccupied much research. She says, and I'm going to quote it directly because it's good, how we wash our bodies, clothes, and living spaces, how we stock our fridges, where our food travels from, and when we throw it away, how we heat and cool our homes and workplaces, how we get to and from place to place. These are all practices that must change, specifically in ways that mitigate their environmental effects. Many of the practices of consumption that need to be lost are ones we may not typically recognize as consumption at all. And she uses what I think is a great example. She says, as she writes, she sits in an office with a radiator that, despite her best efforts, she can't control. When it continues to spew heat into the office, even after the weather has warmed, she has to open a window to keep the ambient temperature to below sauna levels, knowing as she does so that she is hemorrhaging energy from the already old and leaky academic building. So she can make a choice here, but it is strongly framed by the material elements of the building, making this a problem of both individual and collective consumption. Now, this is a reframing from sustainability. And she says that this confronts the voluntarist overtones of research and discourses of sustainable consumption, with their frequent emphasis on developing like pro-environmental attitudes that somehow will lead to like sovereign consumers who make different choices, and instead shows how it is tied to structures. She argues that how we consume is related to how we work. And so this will be a whole new terrain for sociologists to study. She argues that countries with longer working hours, the US, consume more resources and emit more carbon, the US. More work means larger scales of production, higher emissions, certainly higher GDP and stuff, but it also means more spending. And so people buy things rather than make them. They don't have time to make them, and they do have disposable income. It changes the things people buy. And in the rich parts of the world, this tends to be carbon intensive goods and services. Climate change is going to demand like some very imaginative sociological projects to look at these practices of loss. They have to envision in alternative economic and cultural practices that sociology hasn't studied for a really long time. In her conclusion, she argues that we are the victims of climate change because of the use of fossil fuels by large industrialized nations. These climate change losses are going to unfold in a relational and often antagonistic space. I mean, even the very concept of losers implies that someone else won. And so that will lead to antagonism. But these aren't terms where sustainability discourse is comfortable speaking. In sustainability, it's kind of like everybody wins, sort of, kind of, as we all be more sustainable. But the sociology of loss provides, I think, a much better and more realistic way to examine these ongoing transformations that are going to happen. You know, what a sociology of loss loses, perhaps, is like an orientation to climate change that starts from the reassurance that things are going to be okay. A sociology of loss is kind of by definition sad. But, you know, she's not here suggesting that climate change is like only about loss, nor that, you know, more obvious empirical topics related to climate change, like the Kyoto Protocol, climate change denialism, political economies of energy, are somehow like completely irrelevant. Instead, the ambition of this piece is to redirect sociology to look at climate change in a different way. And through that, she wants to bridge into studies in sustainability, but not focus on unrealistic ideas. She ends by saying that loss is an unavoidable human experience under any condition. We are always vulnerable to loss. Climate change research within and beyond sociology has problematized vulnerability, focusing in particular on redress of its uneven distributions along lines of gender, race, class, and region. But despite our best efforts to control it, even the least vulnerable face losses that they cannot anticipate or avoid. And it will be our job to study those things. That's it for this lecture. Definitely downer, but I mean, I really like what Rebecca Elliott does here. Sorry, there's a spider. Anyway, yeah, okay. So thanks for coming to this lecture, and I'll see you all on Wednesday of next week for our last lecture of the quarter. Great.